Okay. Welcome back from spring break. You guys feeling a little bit rested? Ready to get down to the second half of the semester and get going? Or just still tired?
Break wasn't long enough, sadly. Demand a refund.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Nate. So, how many people spotted the bird? Wow.
The bird's on like the left-hand corner under the tree. And the only part you can really see is like the tail.
This is the tail?
Correct.
Yep. There's
His eye and beak are pretty prominent if you catch the pattern rather quickly.
Yep, there's his head with the eye and the beak. Megan, go ahead.
So I have a question. So over break, I went out and I had, I enjoyed myself. I wore my mask, but I somehow still got the flu. And I'm vaccinated from the flu. And when I went to the doctor, they said that the flu vaccine is only 6% effective. So it made me think of this class and I'm like, how is it only 6% effective? That seems super low.
That does sound really low. The flu vaccine is we talked about how the flu strain changes its surface proteins regularly. And those surface proteins are what your immune system responds to. The process of making the flu vaccine takes a while. So they have to make an educated guess about what those surface proteins are going to be. And if there's a really bad mismatch, if the prediction isn't very good, then you have lower efficiency of the vaccine. So it's not one of our better vaccines because of that. Does that clarify things for you?
Yeah, it does. It was just like shocking to hear that, but it makes sense. I mean, with everyone focused on COVID and everything, it's not a surprise that this may have not been like as effective as prior years.
Yeah. Nate, go ahead.
The figure may be off, but isn't it, there's like something like every season, there's like seven different like prominent strains of flu. So they kind of have to make a guess at like which one will be the most prolific, I guess you could say, and that's the one they go with.
Partially, yeah. So that's part of the whole problem. There are not necessarily 7, but multiple strains circulating in the summer before we have in the summer before, and they pick 3 of those to try and make vaccines against. So the vaccine is against 3 different strains of the flu, but if they pick the wrong 3 and one of the ones they didn't pick becomes the prominent one in the winter, then that's when it doesn't work very well. And that's a real common problem. Anything else we want to talk about before we get into the Black Death? I will say that the next COVID surge is starting, not surprisingly. So I strongly encourage people to continue to wear your masks despite the fact that mask mandates have been lifted, because yeah, there's another wave coming. Cases are already starting to go up in New York, Massachusetts, that part of the country where you guys all are. So be aware of that. Okay. Announcements. So we do have a new quiz and journal entry posted. Those are due Sunday, March 27th before midnight. The project will be due before midnight on Sunday, May 1st. So you've got about a month on that. Presentations will be the April 26th and 28th. So they're a little bit before the due date for like papers and that sort of stuff. If you have not yet signed up for a project topic and format type, you better do that now, because we're going to be letting the people who signed up on time do their presentations at the later dates. So if you're wanting to do a presentation, you're going to get bumped earlier in the semester. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet for the people who haven't signed up for and want to do a paper, but it needs to be in. If you're having trouble finding a topic, I got topics for you. I got lots of topics.
So if we submitted our topic and format, we're signed up?
Yes. Yep. Okay. So the Black Death, I want to start by saying, like a lot of the epidemics we've talked about, the information that I have about the Black Death is largely limited to events in Europe and what's called the Near East. So it's kind of the Eastern, in kind of near the Middle East. We know a little bit about what happened in China. We know that the Black Death affected Africa, but we don't know very much about that. And the surviving documents are pretty limited. Nate, go ahead.
That region you described, what was the term you just used for it? Something east?
Near East.
Would that be like the Mediterranean, Greece, Italian peninsula, or is it further than that?
It's further east than that. So it's kind of, okay, we've got Europe. Europe. We've got the Middle East. And then the Near East is usually considered the eastern part of Asia.
So like Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Latvia, Turkey, Georgia, stuff like that.
Yeah, that kind of area. Yep. Bordering Europe. Okay, so when we talk about the Black Death, that was not the term that they were using, the people who were experiencing this were using at the time. They called it things like the pestilence, the great mortality, and the year of annihilation. So the Black Death was a term that started to be used several centuries after this event. It's the common term that we know now. I kind of like the great mortality and the year of annihilation better, but we're going to stick with the Black Death because that's what we're familiar with. Most of the artwork that you're going to see is in the public domain, and it's artwork that was done at the time of the Black Death or shortly thereafter. A lot of it, like this, we don't have necessarily know who created some of these artworks. So if I don't have a reference, I wasn't able to find the original artist. All right, so here is our map. So here's Europe. This is what is now Turkey. Egypt is here. So this is the top part of Africa. This is Saudi Arabia. This area is kind of the area that was called the Near East. So
pretty much most of like the Roman Empire, because I see like that tip of like Africa. I know like Carthage and Tunisia were heavily part of that.
Lots of this was the Roman Empire, although it also spread further north than the Roman Empire did. Yep. So, time period. It peaked in Europe 1347 to 1351. So that's really the time period we're going to be focusing on. This was part of the medieval period, or what's called the Dark Ages. It's called the Dark Ages because we don't have a lot of information about that time period. So we have a lot of information about the Roman Empire, which ended before this, and we have a lot of information from after what's called the Dark Ages. But we're going to talk about what life was kind of like, and it wasn't really dark and horrible. It wasn't necessarily worse than the time period before it. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in this area, which is 50 to 60% of Europe's population. If it came back today, we're talking 1.9 billion. We estimate that the Black Death killed 25% of the world population in this couple of years time period. We can, if we look at charts of population over time, we can see an obvious dip from this period, and it took 200 years for the population to come back to pre-plague levels. 200 years. So the case fatality rate was around 50%, but it varied between communities and between strains of the plague. It could be as much as 90% of a community would be wiped out. Modern day plague still exists, but the modern day with modern treatments, the case fatality rate for this same disease is only around 11%. Only around 11%. Nate, your hand was up first. Go ahead.
That's all right. We can hear from Julia first. I've kind of been dominating the conversation, so I want to give others a chance to speak first.
Okay, Julia, you go first.
Well, I don't even know if you've heard of this, but I think it was around when COVID came about. I saw like a news article or something. It was like California, squirrels in California tested positive. Did you see that for the plague?
I didn't see that, but squirrels in California are plague carriers. Yes.
Really?
Yes. Plague still exists in wild animals in the southeastern United States.
Wow. Okay.
So I guess the question I had was, has the plague, like, I know there's multiple plagues, yeah, like Justinian's plague, this plague, the countless others, have they all been related to the bubonic like plague? Are they all in that family? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Same bacteria. Yes. Yep. We're gonna talk about that today, kind of in our background, the different rounds of the plague and what causes it. Okay, so screenshot time. All right, so this is kind of answering your question, Nate. Plague refers to infection by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. There have been multiple plague pandemics. We have good information that for 4 of these. The first one that we know of was called the Neolithic decline. That was around 5,000 years ago, so around 3,000 years before the Common Era. This one we've just recently learned about. It's not usually talked about when we talk about plagues. We're going to talk very briefly about this in just a second.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever even heard of that one, so it's interesting.
Yep. The plague of Justinian, which was in the Roman Empire, started in the rule of Emperor Justinian in 541 to 542, but it continued for 200 years. Even though we now know there were plague pandemics before this, we call this one the first plague pandemic, because we just learned about the Neolithic decline in the past couple of decades, and this term was used well before now. The Black Death peaked 1347, 1351. This is the one we're going to focus on. It's also called the Second Plague Pandemic, and it continued also for about 200 years. Wait, no, not doing the math, 400 years. There would be periodic outbreaks of the plague for 400 years. Then there was a short break, and the Third Plague Pandemic started in 1855, continued into the 1960s. So only about 100 years. We still have plague. Like Julia said, it still exists. This bacteria still occurs in wildlife. Occasionally people get plague today.
So that would be called a spillover.
That would be a spillover, yes. Okay, so if you want to take a picture of this, so you can keep these dates handy. All right. So let's start with Neolithic decline. So the Neolithic started with the beginning of agriculture. So around this time period, agriculture starts becoming widespread. People start living in cities or larger cities, and we're getting reliable food, specialization of skills. So we get to a point where not everybody has to spend their whole time getting food for themselves. Some people can become potters or basket weavers, various things like that. The big settlements of the time were 10,000 to 20,000 people. So still very small by today's standards. We also see an increase in trade. And we see lots of interactions between people, stored food, and animals. I'm going to read you a quick quote. These mega settlements were the largest settlements in Europe at that time, 10 times bigger than anything else. They had people, animal, and stored food close together, and very likely poor sanitation. That's the textbook example of what you need to evolve new pathogens, to have new pandemics coming out. These mega settlements were all abandoned over a very short time period, about 5,000 years ago. The population of England, where we have good numbers for this time period, declined by 90% over a few years. That is just about all we know about the Neolithic decline. We have been able to find DNA of Yersinia pestis in human remains from that time period. So we know they died of the plague. Nate.
Yeah, I actually doing a little research simultaneously. Apparently, they note that the strain contained an activator gene that caused a pneumonic form of the plague. So I can only imagine how fast that would spread.
Yes, respiratory spread. That's it. I'm sure it flew through the community. Imagine something that spreads as fast as COVID, but has a, much higher mortality rate. Okay, so screenshot if you must, or if you want. Plague of Justinian. So this was really affected what's called the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire at this time had fractured into an Eastern and a Western empire. Again, the death toll was very high, and we estimate that over the 2 centuries, 20% of the world population died. $25 to 50 million people. Importantly, this was not a global pandemic. As far as we can tell, it was pretty limited to the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which covered the Middle East and most of Europe at this time period. So, I mean, come on. 20% of the world population, but it's only a disease of a small part of the world. Jerry, you appreciating this?
I'm not appreciating so many people died, but I was just interested. So many movies from that time period referenced the Black Plague, so I was super happy to actually get some real concrete information on it.
Yep. Okay. Oh, I didn't make another slide for the next one. The third pandemic, which of course we now know was at least the fourth, killed around 10 million out of a world population of 1.2 billion, which is the same thing as 1,200 million. So it was significantly less severe, only around 0.8% of the world population. So
0.8% of the population died. That's what you're saying?
yes.
Oh, okay.
So that's kind of on the same scale as what we're probably going to get out of COVID. Hopefully only that much. But what we really want to talk about is the Black Death. So I'm going to go over life before the Black Death, kind of what it was like to live during the medieval or dark ages. This information, again, it's generalized for Europe, it may only be relevant to one part of Europe. So I may have information from England or from Italy. And I'm just kind of generalizing. Julia, go ahead.
Hi, could you just let us know when to screenshot before you
Oh,
leave?
great. I'm sorry.
No,
do
it's
you,
okay.
do you want me to go back and retype the third pandemic stuff? Yeah, you do. Okay, third pandemic. Killed 10 million people. At the time, the world population was 1.2 billion, or 1,200 million. And that was about 0.8% of the world population. I'm sorry. Yep, there we go.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, these recordings are available if you miss a screenshot, but I have no problem retyping the information. I know it's easier to find it if you just take screenshots than to watch the video.
Yeah, because then I get lost on where everything goes and like.
Yep, no problem. Okay.
So this is the Game of Thrones era of time, Professor?
Yep.
Yes.
That's not how you spell medieval. Okay. So what was life like? First off, medical care. It existed, but it was not great. And it was not available to everyone. So rich people had more access to medical care, but even so, medical care was not great.
That sounds like how it is today.
Yes, yes, it does. There was better medical care in what we called the Islamic world, what is now the Middle East. So during this time period, the Middle East was much more advanced in terms of education, sanitation, healthcare, much more advanced than Europe. And of course, nowadays we think of the Middle East as not as advanced as far as education and all of this stuff. So things can change. Life expectancy. What is life expectancy? We've talked about this.
It's not how long you're expected to live per person. It's not that.
Yes.
It's
yes.
How many people are living and dying and average it all together.
Yes, thank you. So for males in Europe, it was 31 years. Now, what this means is that if you survived childhood, you were likely to live into your 50s or 60s. Although some people would live into their 80s. Childhood mortality was the big driver of this low life expectancy, and it was between 30 and 50%. So between 1/3 and half of all children would die before reaching adulthood.
What about women giving birth? Was it like similar to that, or maybe half?
I don't have actual numbers for that, but yes, childbirth mortality rate was very high as well and contributed to women having a shorter life expectancy. But if women managed to survive childbirth, they would also live into their 50s or 60s, or even as much as 80s. So the Islamic males, at the same time, their life expectancy was around 35. And if you were a scholar, your life expectancy was between 59 and 80. Now that kind of takes out some of the childhood mortality because you're not going to become a scholar when you're a child. But so this group had already by definition survived childhood, but they were definitely living longer. Books were only for the wealthy. Many, many people were illiterate. What is not true? Medieval people were not dirty. They did rarely bathe, but it was because of the fact that they had to haul water and it was hard to heat the water. So the people were more likely to bathe in the summer than the winter. Although many towns had bathhouses where they would heat the water and people could pay to bathe.
But there was no toilet paper. Let's add that part to that. There's no toilet paper and they're not bathing. That's definitely called dirty.
Yes, yes. Toilets did exist though. Again, those were pretty primitive compared to what we have. Most were outhouses. So when you see pictures from movies where people are dumping chamber pots onto the streets, that really was not very common. Even though bathing was rare, hand washing was common. People washed their hands and faces in the morning and washed hands before eating. Nate, go ahead.
Just an off-topic question about outhouses. How come, like, when you see them portrayed in history, they have like that crescent moon symbol on the door? I just wondered what the hell is that and what does it mean?
I have no idea. I know that they would have some sort of ventilation to keep the odors from building up. I guess that might have been decorative form of ventilation.
Maybe a picture way of men and women? Or, I don't know.
No,
Like, no, you don't think so?
no. Because pretty much a family would have one outhouse. Yeah, I have no idea. Okay. Screenshot this.
Also, books were very expensive because they didn't have the printing press yet. So even though people were illiterate, yeah, the books were just extremely valuable.
Yes.
And in the world, in the Indian world as well, the Hindu world, books were kind of made of gold and precious metals and things. So it was a tricky thing.
Yeah, very, very expensive.
And if they were handled too much, they would disintegrate as well.
Yes. Yep. All right, I'm getting ready to clear this. I want to go to the whiteboard for a few minutes. Hang on. There we go. Forgetting how to do everything. All right. So let's set the stage for the plague. There was something called the medieval warm period in Europe. This was not a worldwide phenomenon. but Europe was warmer than average from 950 to 1250, so shortly before the plague. This caused increased crops, improved agriculture. During this time period, they could grow oranges in England. So it was quite warm. And when you have increased food supply, you get an increased population. So the population went up significantly. This time period ended in 1250. Temperatures went down. Crops began to fail, produced less. We all know what's coming here, right? Rinderpest showed up in livestock. I think we talked about rinderpest briefly. It has been eradicated now because rinderpest was a disease that affected hoofed livestock, cows, goats, sheep primarily, and it would have mortality up to 100%. So if rinderpest showed up on your farm, you were going to lose all of your livestock. That was it. Having this high population size and crops that were not doing well, what's going to happen?
Starve. People are going to be starving.
Starvation. In 1315 to 1317, there was a massive, widespread crop failures. And this was the Great Famine. And it killed 500,000 people in England, which is where we had the data from. I don't have a good number for the population in England, but the world population at this time was around 392 million in 1350 or 1300. Between the starvation, the Great Famine, and the Black Death, world population in 1400 was only 390 million. So despite the fact that populations tend to go up for humans, but between the Great Famine and the Black Death, during that 100 years, the population declined. Those who survived the Great Famine, there was lots of malnutrition. We know malnutrition reduces your immune function. Guess who got the best foods?
Royalty, people governing other people, and priests, those type of guys.
Yes, the ruling classes.
That's the word.
Yep. And even in the lower levels, men got first pick. So pregnant women had a lot of malnutrition. So children born during this time had decreased lifelong immune function. So a malnourished mother, the offspring is going to have lifelong problems. Of course, we also get poverty going along with this starvation, this malnutrition. John Kelly wrote that this time period in Europe was like a man standing up to his neck in water. Drowning is not inevitable, but the slightest rise in water level could kill him. And into this came the plague. So we're going to start talking about where the plague came from, where the Black Death plague came from. The information I have is the best information I was able to accumulate, but I'm going to tell you that there's a lot of debate among historians about the origin of the second pandemic. There's been some new information coming to light. This is the information I was able to get, the best information I had. Okay, screenshot this. All right. Asia, 1330s. We're pretty confident the Black Death came out of Asia. At this time period, the areas of China, Mongolia were pretty advanced. There were cities with broad streets. They had fire brigades. Basically means they had firemen. They had clean water canals. They had hospitals. They also had a lot of Italians living there. So these are the people from the area, from the center of what was the Roman Empire, who have moved to China and Mongolia as the Roman Empire declined because conditions were good. They had the money, they could afford to migrate to Asia. In this area, there were a series of earthquakes. And periods of alternating drought and floods, followed by locusts. Oh my goodness. There is the possibility that there was a volcanic eruption in somewhere in Asia that affected this periods of alternating droughts and flood, but it's not clear if that happened. At the same time, in India, there were reigns of frogs, serpents, lizards, and scorpions.
What do you mean by that? Rains, like REIGN?
Nope.
Rain, like fall, precipitation?
Yep.
Oh,
So
wow.
a lot of this is exaggeration or hyperbole, but these sorts of events can happen during extreme rain events, especially if there are associated tornadoes or water sprouts. So these animals they're small, they're lightweight, they can get lifted into the air, and then when the tornado dissipates, they fall out of the sky. Nate, go ahead.
I was just going to comment that it almost sounds biblical, with the locust, drought, flood, pestilence, all that jazz.
Why do you think the people who wrote the Bible talked about these sorts of things? They were very significant.
Yeah.
And I mean, they even happen, we still have plagues of locusts today. primarily in the Middle East and what's called the Horn of Africa, the northwestern corner of Africa. Julia, go ahead.
I was just wondering, when you say pestilence, what does that mean exactly?
Oh, I use the word pestilence. Pestilence is a term for,
Like a sickness, right? Like a wave of great sickness, kind of. That's how
Yeah.
I've always thought of it.
sickness, disease. It can also be related to large numbers of pest animals. So we say a plague of locusts or a pestilence of locusts. It's just a general term for something really horrible happening, specifically related to disease or pests species.
What's your
I heard a faint voice, but I couldn't quite hear you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I was spacing out.
Okay. All right. So these ecological disasters killed around 5 million people. The 1300s were not a good time period to live through.
Were all those dead bodies proposing a health concern as well?
Yes, absolutely. If you don't get them buried, you're in trouble. The 1300s, there were a lot of mass graves, especially after the Black Death came into Europe. Just a desperate attempt to get as many bodies into the ground as possible so that they wouldn't breed diseases and attract rodents and other animals. Okay, screenshot. We're going to go back to the PowerPoints.
And it's almost twofold too, because those rodents, insects would carry diseases.
Yes, yes. All right. So rodents are the reservoir for plagues. What is reservoir or reservoir species?
A large amount, a pool that you can take from that is plentiful.
Yeah, you can use the word pool. Basically, what we're saying is when we say reservoir species and we're talking about diseases, this is an animal that has a specific disease constantly circulating in that population. And this is where a spillover can occur from. When humans interact with the reservoir.
Back to the bats, huh?
Back to the bats, but not this time.
No, I mean similar. These are rats or bats with wings, or vice versa, rather, without wings.
Yeah, they're actually not closely related to rodents at all. Okay, so what do I mean when I say rodents? Mice, rats, gerbils. My cat is going crazy in here. Hang on, she distracted me.
She heard rodents.
Yes.
Squirrels, squirrels.
Groundhogs, squirrels. Yep. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Different rodents vary in their susceptibility to the plague. So some rodents, like the ground squirrels in the southwestern US, can survive the plague with very few symptoms. They don't tend to die. Others will have high mortality rates. So if it gets into a rodent that doesn't normally have plague, oftentimes you're going to have higher mortality rates. So in the area, China and Mongolia, there was a drought. Grasslands could no longer support rodent populations. So what are the rodents doing? Rodents moved out and started interacting with people. People had food supplies.
Was this time period coinciding with the Khanate rule in like the greater Mongolia, China era?
Nate, once again, you're on the next slide already. Yes, we're going to talk about the Khanate. Just a little bit. Okay, so you probably have already heard it's not the rodents who give the plague to people. It's the rodent fleas that spread plague to humans. Okay, screenshot. The Mongol Empire. At this time, it was the largest empire on the planet. It was one of the big ones. And it stretched from the Sea of Japan into Siberia and nearly to the Mediterranean. And what is now, and parts of what is now Eastern Europe. So it spread from here across to this area, as well as this part of Asia. It connected what we call the East and the West. During this time, there was something called the Pax Mongolica. What does Pax mean? Nate, you know this one, I'm sure.
A pact as in P-A-C-T or P-A-X?
P-A-X.
I'm guessing it's some kind of grand meeting or something of that nature.
Peace.
Oh, peace, okay. Well, I've heard the term pause meaning peace, but I'm not familiar with pax being peace. So
Yep.
I'll add that to the ever-growing vocabulary list.
There we go. Good. So having this enforced peace, what does this mean? It's basically more like law enforcement. So bandits, criminals would be hopefully apprehended correctly and punished. Nate, go ahead.
Is this might be like, I might be connecting two irrelevant topics, but when you're talking about enforced Pax Mongolica, are you talking about how the Mongols, they'd conquer a nation, but then they'd put their people like in positions of power and they'd like force compliance with that? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that was part of it. Yep. So this peace that they enforced allowed increased trade and travel. If it's dangerous to travel, if you're likely to get attacked and robbed or killed, yeah, you don't want to travel as much. But with this peace period, there was a lot of increase in trade and travel. They also created something called the YAM, which was a postal service where they would carry information and messages. So this was very peaceful, but like all great things, the Mongol Empire started to break up in the early 1300s. So we have the loss of a stabilizing government. We have ecological damage. We have mass malnutrition and starvation in Europe. So we think the Black Death spilled over into the human population somewhere in this area. This is China here, this is Mongolia here, or modern day Mongolia. So we think it started around here. And it spread along the trade routes. So the trade routes traveling both mostly straight over to the Middle East, the Mediterranean. We don't have a lot of good information about the plague in Asia. We know there was a plague outbreak in 1338, 1339 in Kazakhstan, and in 1346 in India and Russia. So that's slightly before it really started hitting Europe. Our best information is from the Mediterranean region.
So, Professor, have any of the plagues or viruses we talked about this whole course affected Australia? Are they like super isolated and lucky in that capacity?
They're pretty isolated. So in order to get to Australia during this time period, you have to go island hopping through what's called the South China Sea and the Southern Pacific. Anytime arriving at a place requires a long travel period, you're less likely to carry a disease with you, because you'll recover from it if it's a minor disease, or you'll die from it if it's something severe.
And the travel boats was pretty slow back then too. So it if it was going to kill you, it would kill you.
Yep. It took a long time to get there. Not like today. Today, if the plague hit, it would definitely make it everywhere. I'd also like to point out that this is a crappy map because Africa is a hell of a lot bigger than it looks on this. That's one of those little things that bothers me. I think there's some racism behind the fact that Africa always looks much smaller on maps than it really is. Okay.
I don't think a lot of people know Brazil is the size of America. When I found that out, I was like, what the hell type of maps were we looking at?
Oh yeah, our maps are not to scale. They absolutely are not to scale.
I thought, oh, sorry. I thought they were just like that because it's like a weird, like, never mind. It's like because the Earth is like round and they have to like draw maps on like a flat like canvas. So
Yes,
some countries look bigger than they actually are. and
yes,
some look smaller.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. There are different ways of drawing maps, and depending on what technique you use, either the countries are not the correct sizes, or they're the correct sizes, but they might not be accurate as far as what's close to what else. So yeah, there are different ways to do it, but definitely globe is the correct way to project.
Or the third way, cartographical racism. I
Yeah.
think that's the word, cartography. That's
Cartography, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, we've long centered our maps on either Europe or now the United States. So that's where they're going to be most accurate, because who's drawing them? Okay. So even though the Mongol Empire was starting to fragment, some groups of Mongols were trying to move into what is now Europe. And specifically, pick a different color for the arrow. They were going after the city of Kaffa. It's a wealthy city, or it was a wealthy city, on the Crimea. So that body of water is the Crimea. And it was established by Italians from the Genoa area. It had a very diverse culture for the time period. The Mongol army took surrounded Kaffa, and they laid siege to the city. And I think I misspelled siege. So Kaffa was a walled city. The Mongol army was outside the wall, and the Mongols started to get the plague and die. We suspect that the rodents who were carrying the plague were carried with trade along these trade routes. So the Genoese in the city thought God had come to save them. Boy, were they wrong. The Mongols, however, knew that plague could be spread by contact with dead bodies. So what do you think the Mongols did?
Surrounded the city with corpses, threw them over the gates.
Oh, use them as weapons? Wow.
Yes.
Warfare.
They literally catapulted bodies into the city over the walls.
This is a wild time, man. And no toilet paper. Let's get back to that part.
And no toilet paper, yes. Okay, Jerry, so it looks like there's a closet behind you. If you open that, is it full of toilet paper?
Actually, books.
From March 2020, he stocked up so much, he's still good to go.
I just don't understand that it wasn't what they use sand and dirt, bro. Like that is crazy to me.
Or the right hand, or the left.
Yeah, what hand it was, like that is
Corn
just
cobs.
ridiculous to me. Like what?
Corn cobs.
Really?
Yeah.
Don't throw that away. We need it for the bathroom.
Okay. So biological warfare. This is the first time we have written evidence for biological warfare. All right, good time for a screenshot. So what do you think the Genoese did? They fled in ships across the water, and they went, some went back to Genoa, some went to Marseille, France, some went to Constantinople. Constantinople, spelled wrong, no. So Constantinople is here. Genoa is
That was
here.
Istanbul.
I'm
No, it was a joke because they changed the name from Constantinople to Istanbul. Sorry.
yeah, you had me for a second there, and I was like, wait a minute. So guess what else they carried with them? Plague. And they would stop. Boats would not travel long distances through the Mediterranean. I mean, why would you? So they would stop at Constantinople, get supplies, trade passengers, stop at Athens.
And the rats will get off the boats.
The rats and infected people would get off the boats. Yep.
And they have no idea this little thing, this little flea, the little blood in its belly is transmitting.
Not a clue.
That's a hard thing to figure out, man.
So it was the blood from the fleas. They would bite the people, but then why doesn't it work for mosquitoes?
Okay. So we're going to get to that. But basically what happens is the fleas are affected by the plague. And what the plague does is it causes a blockage in the flea's digestive tract. So the flea will bite a person, taking a blood meal, but their digestive tract is blocked, so then they vomit that up.
What?
And so they don't vomit all of it up. Some of it stays in their digestive tract, but some of it, and so the part that stays in their digestive tract, they go to the next person, they get another blood meal, and they vomit it up again. But
So
some
it's
of
a
the,
constant transference.
it's a constant transference. Yes.
Clever. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah. And it's even more clever than that because the fleas are now starving.
So they're biting more often.
Mm.
Mhm.
More biting and puking, I'm sorry.
More biting, more puking. Exactly.
What the hell?
It's crazy to think these pathogens aren't somewhat sentient, that they don't know what they're doing. But I
They
don't.
have no clue what they're doing. This is evolution, man. Evolution can do some crazy stuff. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I don't know that you really need to copy that down, but if you do, go ahead. All right. So conditions that increase the risk of epidemics. We've been talking about these. Movement of people, trade, travel, immigration, fleeing, war zones, fleeing, can't spell this today, starvation, poor economic conditions,
I guess
Forms of
oppression would be like an umbrella term
Yep,
to describe that. Yeah. Okay.
various forms of oppression. Yep, absolutely. We see malnutrition. We see overcrowding. We see exposure to wildlife. We see these conditions over and over and over again. Has anybody heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse?
Yes.
Isn't one of them disease?
Pestilence, I think.
Yeah. So there's
Yep.
war, death, pestilence,
And hunger, isn't it? No.
starvation, yes, or hunger. What have we got? War, starvation, disease, and death. These all go together over and over throughout history. What do we have going on in the world right now?
Oh my God, that's so scary. Stop.
It's not the apocalypse coming, because these kinds of conditions tend to co-occur over and over and over again.
Yeah, you
One-
could say since the dawn of man that's
Yes.
been prevalent. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, war is going to cause people to abandon their farms. There's going to be starvation that results. They get people being displaced, which means they can carry diseases, and you get pestilence coming along with it. And of course, death. Yep, it makes sense that these all go together. Any comments on this? We're about out of time here.
I know there are a lot of priests, religious leaders that are harping on this and utilizing this as a scare tactic or just to substantiate what they've been preaching.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Timeless method of getting people into hysteria.
Yeah, for sure, bro.
Yep. Religion uses these kinds of things. The media is using these kinds of things.
This is why I took this class, exactly why I needed like full clarity from the scientific perspective.
Yep. That's what I'm here for.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we wrap it up for the day?
So since it's another wave of Corona, we're going to be getting boosted again? Because I died that time.
I know. I don't know when the next round of boosters is going to come out, but I'm sorry, Jerry, we're going to need boosters.
Again, for sure.
Again.
Before the year's over, we're going to get boosted.
I just saw an article that said that the US might not be able to afford to make it free for everyone, essentially. But I mean, I don't know how that makes sense when there's been countless other government spending, but I guess that's not a priority, right?
Yeah, it's a priority thing. Absolutely. When our
Um,
government spends how much money on the military?
Yep.
It's like 100, isn't it like 100 billion or something? Or
It's an insane amount of money. We could take half of the military budget and provide basically free healthcare for all Americans.
But there's a new one. We have a Space Force, guys. A Space Force that they're spending millions on.
no.
Defending us from the aliens. Yeah.
That had been in talks for years. I'd say.
No, Trump put some money into it when he was.
No, I know, but it was the Air Force. Like they've been talking about like that because they kind of already do like cyberspace operations and like they augment some NASA missions. I wasn't surprised when they announced it, to be honest. I know, Professor, we had talked about that quiz grade in the email. I know you probably were busy, and I don't want to like be a pest about it, but
It's on my list.
yeah. Okay.
I haven't forgotten, Nate.
Okay. Take care, y'all.
Bye.
I know, right? See you guys later. I forgot time was up.
Time is
Stay
up.
black. Thank you.
See you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye.